She was traded for a debt of £400, not sold at auction, not bartered at a market. Traded. Like a piece of furniture that someone had grown tired of, handed across a dinner table between two men who were laughing as they did it. The joke, as Desmond Farley told it, was that the Duke of Waverley would never know the difference. He was wrong. He was catastrophically, irreversibly, devastatingly wrong. And by the time he understood this, standing in a candle-lit card room with a document in his shaking hands and 20 witnesses at his back, it was already too late for him to do anything about it. Welcome to the Duke's revenge. She had been invisible for so long that she had begun to mistake it for safety. This is the Duke's revenge, where the coldest hearts burn the hottest and the women society tried to silence become the most dangerous forces in England. And tonight I have a story for you that I have been turning over in my mind since the moment it took shape, because it is unlike anything I have told you before. It is a story about cruelty disguised as comedy, about a woman who was handed to a man as the punchline of a joke, and about what happens when the man the world thought was diminished turns out to be the most dangerous person in any room he has ever entered. Before we step into this world together, tell me, where in the world are you right now? What time is it where you are? Whether you are in bed with the lights off, commuting through a city that has not woken up yet, or stealing an hour of quiet in a house full of noise, drop your city and your local time in the comments. This community stretches around the globe, and I love knowing who is listening alongside me. Now, our story. Winifred Alcott was 23 years old, the eldest daughter of a man who had gambled away every inheritance she might have expected, and she had the particular kind of quietness that comes not from timidity but from long practice at being overlooked. She had learned over the years to move through rooms without disturbing them, to speak only when spoken to fold herself small enough that the contempt of others passed over her like weather. Cold, yes, but not personal. Never personal. She had also, entirely without intending to, become the subject of Desmond Farley's most elaborate joke. And that is where our story truly begins. But before I take you to the beginning, I want to take you to a night 3 weeks later, to a bedchamber in Waverley House, London, lit by a bank of candles whose light caught the gold threads in the curtains and sent shadows rippling across a ceiling 3 times the height of any room Winifred had ever slept in. She was sitting at a dressing table, still in her wedding gown, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. She did not know what she was waiting for. She did not know what happened next, in a marriage made between strangers, in a house the size of a small village, on a night that the whole of London society already considered a farce. The door opened. He was tall. She had noted that in the chapel, in the way one notes things when one is trying very hard not to feel anything. Tall and dark, and utterly, completely still in the way that powerful men sometimes are, as though the world moves around them, rather than with them. He crossed the room with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once been refused anything he wanted. He stopped 3 feet from her. And then, and this is the moment that every person who witnessed it later said they could not explain, the moment that circulated through drawing rooms for months afterward, he looked at her. Not at her reflection in the glass. At her. And he said her name. Winifred. Not your Grace, not Madam. Her name, precisely, clearly, with the particular deliberateness of a man who had been practicing it. The 2 maids, still in the room, went very still. The footman in the corridor, who would later claim he had not been listening, went very still. And Winifred herself, Winifred, who had been traded for a debt and handed over as a joke, felt something in her chest crack open like ice at the end of a long winter, because no one had told him her name. She had not told him her name. It had not appeared in any of the marriage documents. Her father, who had been drunk at the signing, had referred to her throughout as the girl. And the Duke of Waverley, whom society called deaf, whom Desmond Farley had chosen precisely because he was believed to be deaf, had just said her name. In the hush of that candle-lit room, with 2 maids and a footman as witnesses, Winifred Alcott looked at her husband for the first time and understood that the joke had never been on her. Now, let me take you back, 3 weeks earlier, to where this truly began. Now it is important to understand something about deafness in 1854 England before we go any further, because the world Winifred moved through had a particular cruelty where disability was concerned, and because the specific nature of Piers Hawthorne's deafness matters to everything that follows. There are 2 kinds of deafness that physicians in the Victorian era were beginning, slowly and imprecisely, to distinguish. The first is deafness present from birth or early childhood, before speech is fully acquired. The second is what was sometimes called acquired deafness, or post-lingual deafness. Hearing lost in adulthood, after a person has already learned to speak. Piers Hawthorne had lost his hearing at the age of 19 to a fever that had burned through him for 11 days and left him alive and profoundly changed. He had been at Cambridge when it happened, a young man in his 2nd year, already known for a mind that his tutors found alternately brilliant and inconvenient. He had entered that fever hearing. He had left it in silence, because he had already acquired speech, had been speaking. For 19 years had a voice fully formed and a tongue that remembered its work. He retained the ability to produce spoken words. Not easily, not without effort and practice. Speech without hearing feedback is a discipline, not a gift, and Piers had chosen to exercise it rarely, reserving it for moments of his own choosing rather than performing it for a world that had already decided what he was. The medical understanding of all of this in 1854 England was primitive at best. Physicians categorized deafness as everything from a moral failing to a sign of intellectual deficiency. An aristocrat who could not hear was assumed to be diminished in all other respects, unable to participate in the oral performance of power that the ruling class required. The ability to orate in Parliament, to dominate a dinner table with wit, to make the cutting remark at precisely the right social moment. These were the currencies of aristocratic authority, and a man who dealt in none of them was assumed bankrupt. This was, of course, an absurdity. Power does not live in the ears. But Desmond Farley believed it did, and that belief was the foundation of everything that followed. Winifred had met Desmond Farley 3 times before she understood what he was. The first time, he had been charming. The second time, he had been attentive. The third time, at a card party at the Edgeworth townhouse, surrounded by the particular cruelty of Blanche Edgeworth's social circle, he had been himself. She had arrived at that party as she arrived everywhere, quietly, in a gown that was clean and carefully pressed, but 3 seasons out of fashion, with her younger sister Tabitha beside her, and a determined expression she wore the way other women wore jewels, as armor, as decoration, as proof that she had not yet surrendered. Blanche Edgeworth had noticed her arrival with the particular alertness of a woman whose power depended on knowing exactly where every threat was, positioned at all times. Blanche was not beautiful in any conventional sense, but she wielded her social position with the precision of a surgeon and the appetite of something considerably less civilized. She had decided some 2 years prior that Winifred Alcott was beneath notice, and had communicated this decision to every significant person in her social orbit with the efficiency of a general deploying troops. Miss Alcott. Blanche had not even looked up from her cards. How brave of you to come. I thought perhaps you had been, what is the word, retired. The laughter that moved around the table was quiet and knowing and precisely calibrated to sting. Winifred had smiled. It was the smile she had been perfecting since she was 16 years old. Not warm, not cold, but entirely unreadable, offering nothing for cruelty to grip. "How kind of you to worry," she said. "You are as attentive as ever, Mrs. Edgeworth." It was not much, but it was enough to make Desmond Farley, seated across the table, look at her with something new in his expression. He watched her handle it. The smile, the steadiness, the way she absorbed the laughter without flinching, and felt the particular interest of a man who has identified something useful. Winifred Alcott was not, he had decided within the first 30 seconds of the Edgeworth card party, a woman of any significance. But she was, he now revised, a woman of a specific kind of endurance, the kind that comes from years of practice, the kind that would not make scenes, would not create difficulties, would accept what she was given and be grateful. She was, in short, the kind of woman who could be handed to a deaf duke a settlement of a gambling debt, and who would understand, without needing to be told explicitly, that this was the best she was ever going to do. He found this enormously convenient. He sought her out in the interval between card games, when Tabitha had been drawn into conversation by a distant cousin, and Winifred stood alone near the window with a glass of lemonade she had no intention of drinking. "You handled that well," he said. She looked at him. He was handsome in the way of men who know they are handsome. A handsomeness maintained with careful effort, slightly too polished, slightly too aware of itself. "I beg your pardon?" "Mrs. Edgeworth." He gestured toward the card table with the easy familiarity of a man who believed himself immune to social consequences. "She has been sharpening herself on women like you for years. Most of them cry. Women like you." She noted the phrase and filed it carefully. "I don't cry at card parties," she said. "No." He studied her with an expression she would later understand was not admiration, but assessment. "I don't think you do." He moved on shortly afterward, called away by a laugh and a beckoning hand. Winifred watched him go and felt, despite herself, a small warmth at having been noticed. This was the first of her mistakes. It would not be the last. Now here is what Winifred did not know, and what I must tell you now so that you understand the full dimensions of what was done to her. Desmond Farley had a gambling problem of the particular variety that is dressed in expensive clothes and told in charming stories. He had debts across half of London to moneylenders, to fellow players, to men whose patience had long since expired. He had been managing these debts for years with the skill of a juggler, keeping objects in the air through sheer velocity, borrowing here to pay there, charming creditors into extensions, selling off things that were not quite his to sell. And he had, some months prior, made the catastrophic error of losing £400 to Piers Hawthorne, Duke of Waverley. £400 was not, to a man of the Duke's fortune, a significant sum. But Desmond Farley did not have £400. He did not, at that precise moment, have £4. He had, however, a different kind of currency in mind. The Duke of Waverley was unmarried. He was 31 years old, possessed of a dukedom, £40,000 a year, 3 estates, and a reputation that combined genuine power with enough whispered mystery to keep the curious at a distance. He had never shown serious interest in any woman presented to him. Farley had looked at these facts and arrived at what he considered a solution of genuine elegance. He would pay his debt with a wife, specifically with Winifred Alcott, whom nobody wanted, whom nobody was watching, whom nobody would miss from the marriage market because she had long since been written off as a permanent fixture of it. He would approach her father, who needed money badly enough to agree to anything. He would arrange the match. and he would collect from the Duke's man the acknowledgement that the debt was cleared. The joke? The part that delighted him. The part he told afterward at his club over brandy to laughter that moved around the room like a wave, was that the Duke would never know he had been given someone's leftover. He couldn't participate in society. He would take what he was given and be grateful for the charity. He told this joke, with embellishments, to 6 men at his club. He told it loudly. He did not know, because he was a man who had never considered that consequences applied to him, that 2 of those 6 men had reasons of their own to ensure that the Duke of Waverley heard every word. Now, I want to tell you something about what it means to be a duke in 1854 England, because the word gets used so often in stories like this that it can begin to seem like a romantic title rather than a description of genuine, almost incomprehensible power. A duke was the highest rank of the British peerage, second only to the royal family. In 1854, there were fewer than 30 dukedoms in the English peerage. Piers Hawthorne, Duke of Waverley, controlled 3 estates spanning more than 40,000 acres, held influence in multiple county governments, sat in the House of Lords, and commanded a kind of social authority that could make or break a family's fortunes with a single letter. £40,000 a year. To understand this sum, a respectable gentleman lived well on £500 a year. A family of comfortable means might manage on £2,000. £40,000 a year was a figure so removed from ordinary experience that it existed in a different category of reality entirely. The kind of wealth that does not merely purchase things but purchases outcomes, verdicts, silences, the direction of events. When a duke decided to act, truly act, with the full weight of his position and his resources and his 15 years of carefully accumulated patience, there was very little in England that could stop him. Desmond Farley had gambled with that power as though it were a hand of cards. He had lost the moment he placed the bet. Winifred's father came to her on a Tuesday morning in late February, when the light through the windows was the particular grey of English winter that makes everything look as though it has already been defeated. He sat across from her in the small parlour that served as her domain. She had claimed it years ago, after her mother's death, because it was the room no one else wanted. And he had the expression of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say and found it insufficient. "There has been an offer," he said. She set down her needlework. "From whom?" "The Duke of Waverley." She went very still. Her father mistook this stillness for the right kind, for pleasant surprise, for flattered silence. He continued with the careful pacing of a man managing information. "It is a good match, an extraordinary match. The man is wealthy beyond... well, you understand. And the connection, why me?" She said it quietly, not accusingly. A genuine question. Her father's eyes moved briefly to the left. "Why not you?" She had been having conversations with her father for 23 years. She knew what it meant when his eyes moved to the left. "What has been promised in return?" she said. The silence that followed answered her more thoroughly than any words could have. "How much?" £400. He said it quickly, in the manner of removing a plaster. "It is a debt. A debt Farley has been carrying, and the Duke's man made the proposal through him. And I have agreed in principle, but nothing is signed. Nothing is... Farley." She said the name carefully. "Desmond Farley arranged this. He acted as intermediary, yes, but the offer is genuine. The title is real. And I am the currency." She was not angry. She examined the thought and found it true, and was not angry, which perhaps said everything about... what 23 years of being managed had done to her capacity for outrage. She was simply very tired and very clear-eyed and thinking hard. A duke, a real duke, with a real title and real power in exchange for a debt of £400, arranged by a man who thought it was amusing. She thought about Blanche Edgeworth's face at the card table. She thought about Tabitha, 17 and kind and sharp as a pin, who deserved a season and new gowns and a future that their father's debts were rapidly foreclosing. She thought about herself, in this small parlour, in 3 seasons-old gowns, folding herself smaller and smaller until there was nothing left to fold. She thought about a man she had never met who had apparently agreed to marry a woman someone else had selected for him, which meant that whatever his reasons, they were not romantic, which meant that she and this deaf duke might have something in common after all. They were both, it seemed, being managed. "I will meet him," she said, "before anything is signed. I will meet him." Her father looked relieved. He should not have. Piers Hawthorne, Duke of Waverley, received Winifred Alcott in his study at 2:30 on a Thursday in March, and she understood within 30 seconds that she had walked into a situation considerably more complex than anyone had told her. The room itself was information. It occupied more square footage than the entire ground floor of her father's house, lined with books that had been read rather than displayed. She could tell by the broken spines the way certain volumes stood at slight angles from repeated use. A desk held papers in organized stacks, a letter in progress, an inkwell and 2 pens. Maps covered one wall, framed and annotated in a hand that was precise and small and covered every available margin. A globe positioned at arm's reach from the primary chair. This was not the room of a man who had retreated from the world. This was the room of a man who was running something. He rose when she entered. She had been told he was 31. He looked it, not old, not young, with the particular quality of a man who had stopped thinking about his appearance some years ago because he had more important things to think about. Dark hair, grey eyes, a jaw that suggested he did not easily change his mind. Tall and completely, entirely composed. His man, Roderick, she learned later, who had been with the Duke since he was 20, stood slightly to one side and began, the moment she entered, to communicate with his hands in a system of gestures she had never seen before. She had been told to speak slowly and clearly and to face him directly so he could read her lips. She had been told this by her father, who had it from Farley, who had assembled his information from 15 years of society gossip. She had practiced a version of this, a careful, slow-spoken performance of herself, words chosen for their visible shape. She discarded it entirely. "Your Grace," she said, at her normal pace, her normal register, "I believe we have both been placed in a peculiar position." Roderick's hands moved. The Duke's eyes moved to her, then back to Roderick, then back to her. One corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, the ghost of one, the acknowledgement in a face carefully trained to neutrality that she had surprised him. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat. He sat. Roderick positioned himself between them. What followed was the strangest conversation of her life. Her speaking at her normal pace, Roderick translating into hand signs and occasionally voicing the Duke's responses, the Duke watching her with those steady grey eyes and responding through Roderick with a precision and economy of language that told her, within 10 minutes, everything she needed to know. He was not diminished. He was not confused. He was not the passive recipient of Farley's charity. He was the most intelligent person she had ever sat across from. "You know why Farley arranged this?" she said. Not a question. Roderick signed. The Duke's response came back through Roderick's voice, clipped and direct. "I know everything Farley believes he has arranged." She parsed this carefully. "Believes he has arranged. Then you know what he thinks of the proposition." "I know what he told his friends at his club," Roderick said, on the Duke's behalf, "approximately 4 hours after the conversation with your father." She stared. "How?" The Duke looked at her steadily for a moment. Then Roderick, with the slight flatness of a man delivering a line he has delivered before. "Your Grace declines to explain his intelligence methods." Despite everything, despite the peculiarity of the situation, despite the £400 hanging over the conversation, despite her father's averted eyes and Farley's laughter, she hadn't yet heard but could already imagine. Winifred felt something move in her chest that was unmistakably amusement. "I see," she said. She folded her hands in her lap. "Then I suppose my question is, why proceed?" The pause before Roderick translated was slightly longer than the others. The Duke looked at her for a moment, that steady, measuring grey gaze, before he signed his response. "Because," Roderick said, "Farley requires a lesson, and I find I require a duchess." She spent the following 2 weeks in 4 more conversations with Piers Hawthorne, in that study with the annotated maps and the worn books, with Roderick between them and the grey March light coming through the windows. They were not courtship conversations in any sense that Blanche Edgeworth would have recognised. There were no compliments on her appearance. There were no attempts to impress. There was no performance of any kind. There was instead conversation, real conversation, of the variety Winifred had been conducting almost entirely inside her own head for years, because there had been no one around her willing to sustain it. He asked what she read. He asked what she thought about what she read. He asked about Tabitha, whom she had mentioned once in passing, and listened with genuine attention when she spoke about Tabitha's mind and Tabitha's precarious position in a household whose finances were declining. He told her, through Roderick, that he had been researching her father's financial situation since 2 days after Farley's proposition, not to assess her value, but to understand what she was navigating. "That is either reassuring or alarming," she told him. "I haven't decided which." Roderick translated. The Duke's response: "It is practical. You have been navigating this alone for years. I prefer to understand the terrain." She looked at him. He looked at her. "What do you want from this?" she asked. Not coyly, not defensively, directly. "Not Farley's lesson. From the marriage itself." The pause this time was longer. She watched his face, that controlled, careful face, and saw something move behind his eyes that was not strategic and not composed. Something that had been waiting, she sensed, for someone to ask. "I want," Roderick said after a moment, "someone who does not pretend." She understood this more completely than he could have known. "The same," she said quietly. "I want exactly the same." It was during the 3rd conversation that she first heard him speak. She had asked him something. A question about the estate, about the practical arrangements she would be expected to manage. And Roderick had been momentarily occupied with a note that had arrived at the door. In the small silence, Piers had looked at her across the desk, and then, with the particular deliberateness of a man choosing something carefully, he had said a single word. "Roderick." Just the name. Summoning. His man. But she had heard it, clear, precisely produced, quieter than she had expected, but unmistakable. And she had understood in that instant that the silence society had assigned him was not the silence of a man without a voice. It was the silence of a man who had decided that his voice belonged to him and would be deployed on his own terms. She did not comment on it. She understood instinctively that to remark on it would be to make it a performance, and it had not been offered as one. But she had noted it. She had noted it with the completeness of someone who has been given information she did not know she needed. The 3rd week of March, she signed the marriage contract. Now it is important to understand what Winifred signed away on that morning in late March, because the law of England in 1854 made it something considerably more than a name on a page. Under the doctrine of coverture, the legal framework governing married women that would not be significantly reformed until the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, a woman ceased to exist as an independent legal person the moment her wedding vows were spoken. Her property became her husband's property. Her wages, if she earned any, became his. Her legal identity did not merely merge with his, it disappeared into his entirely, leaving nothing behind that the law would recognize as hers. She could not sign contracts in her own name, could not bring legal action, could not own anything independently, could not make decisions about her own children in the eyes of the law. This is what marriage meant in 1854, not a partnership, a legal erasure. When Winifred Alcott signed that marriage contract on a grey morning in late March, this specific woman, with this specific pen on this specific page, she did not merely choose a husband. She signed away every legal protection her independent existence had offered her, which were few enough already, and placed the entirety of what remained of her life into the hands of a man she had met 4 times, a man she had chosen, yes, with clear eyes and clear information, but chosen under a law that gave her no mechanism to unchoose if she had been wrong. She was not wrong, but she did not yet know that. And the courage of what she did, walking into that study, sitting across from that desk, signing her name, is not diminished by the fact that it worked out. It is made larger by it. The wedding was held in the private chapel at Waverley House on a morning in late March when the London light was doing its best impression of spring and falling somewhat short. Piers did not celebrate things publicly when they could be handled privately, and the chapel, small, stone-floored, with narrow windows that sent the morning light in long, cold bars across the flagstones, suited both of them in ways neither had to explain to the other. Winifred had no one on her side of the chapel whose presence she particularly wanted, except Tabitha, who sat in the front pew with her eyes very bright and her hands folded in her lap, looking at her sister with an expression that said, "I don't entirely understand what is happening, but I trust you." Desmond Farley was there. He had insisted on witnessing the event he believed he had orchestrated. He sat near the back with 2 friends, and Winifred caught from the corner of her eye the particular, satisfied expression of a man who believes himself the cleverest person present. He had never been further from the truth. The ceremony was conducted by the household's own clergyman, properly, gravely, with the full weight of legal and religious authority behind each word. Winifred stood beside Piers and said the words she was required to say, and he said the words he was required to say, for he could speak, she had learned in their 3rd conversation, when he chose to. And Roderick, standing just behind and to the right, signed throughout with a practice so fluid as to be invisible to those not looking. When the ring went on her finger, Hawthorne gold, old and heavy and very real, she looked up at him and found him already looking at her, not at the ceremony, not at the clergyman, at her. The look lasted only a moment, but it was the look of a man who has been waiting for something and has now, finally, stopped waiting. Blanche Edgeworth, who had not been invited and had therefore not been present, the private chapel at Waverley House admitting only those with explicit reason to be there, would learn of the wedding the following morning from the announcement in the papers, and would spend a significant portion of that day recalibrating her understanding of what had just occurred. Farley, walking out afterward, was laughing. He would not be laughing for very much longer. Waverley House was the kind of house that changes your understanding of scale. Winifred had known, intellectually, that it would be large. She had not understood large in the way she understood it, when the carriage turned into the street and she saw the facade. 4 stories of pale stone, 12 bays wide, with a front door that required 2 footmen to open simultaneously, and an entrance hall whose marble floor reflected the candlelight from a chandelier so large it seemed less like a fixture than a weather event. The walls were panelled in pale wood, above wainscoting of deep green, hung with portraits whose subjects watched her arrival with the particular blankness of people who have been watching arrivals for centuries. The smell of the place reached her before anything else. Beeswax and old roses, and something beneath both that was simply the smell of rooms that had always been warm, always been lit, never once in their history gone without. Inside, 32 servants assembled in the entrance hall for the formal greeting that a duchess warranted. 32 people whose livelihoods depended on the smooth running of this house, who looked at Winifred with expressions ranging from cautious assessment to careful deference. She stood very straight. She did not look away from any of them. She let the silence sit for a moment, long enough to demonstrate that it did not unnerve her. "Good evening," she said, clearly and without nervousness. "I look forward to learning how this house works. I expect it will take some time, and I ask for your patience." Mrs. Price's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not quite a smile, but its near relation, something settling into place. Piers stood slightly behind her during this. She was aware of him the way she had learned to be aware of him in rooms, as a specific weight, a specific quality of attention. And she knew, without looking, that he was watching her. Later, after she had been shown the rooms that were hers, after she had washed and stood for a moment alone at the window of a bedchamber, roughly the size of her father's entire upper floor, looking out at the London street below where carriages moved through the gaslit dark like ships crossing black water, she turned around and found Roderick in the doorway. "Your Grace requests," Roderick said with the practiced neutrality of a man who has learned to present information without commentary, "that you join him for dinner if you are willing. He says, also, that there is no obligation." She thought about this for a moment. The no obligation. The care embedded in those 3 words. "Tell him I am willing." Dinner was quiet in the way that is different from awkward silence. The quiet of 2 people who do not feel the need to fill space with noise, who are already comfortable with the shape of each other's company, in a way that should have taken years to develop, and had somehow taken weeks. Roderick was present, positioned slightly back from the table, available, but not intrusive. The food was extraordinary in the manner of things that are very good, and require no announcement. A clear soup that tasted of long patience. A saddle of lamb with sauce that she ate more of than she intended. A dessert of preserved plums in brandy syrup that arrived in crystal glasses, and tasted, she thought, like the idea of plenty. He asked her about the house. She told him honestly that it was overwhelming. He watched Roderick sign this, and something moved in his expression that might, from a different man, have been called affection. She asked him, she had been thinking about it all day, about the signing, about whether Roderick always... She stopped, because she had suddenly realized she was asking a question that might be impertinent. He caught the hesitation, the slight tilt of his head she had come to recognize as a question. "I was going to ask," she said, "about how you communicate. Whether Roderick is always Asa. I realize I don't know how to ask this without making it sound like an intrusion." Roderick translated. The Duke looked at her for a moment. Then, with the economy that characterized everything he did, He reached across the table and turned a small card that had been lying face down near his plate. In very clear handwriting, "I am teaching myself to lip read in English. I can already manage it in French. I ask for patience while I practice." She looked at the card. She looked at him. "French first?" The Duke's response came back dry. "My French tutor was more patient than my English one." She laughed. A real laugh, not the careful social sound she produced at card parties, but the genuine article. Startled out of her, unguarded, she saw his expression shift in response to it. Not a laugh, not even a smile, but something warming, like light changing in a room when a cloud moves off the sun. "I will be patient," she said, when she had recovered herself, "and I would like to learn the signs, if that is permitted, if it would be useful." The pause before his response was brief, and when Roderick voiced it, his inflection was carefully neutral. "He says it would be more than useful. He says he was not going to ask." She nodded as though this were practical, as though the warmth rising in her chest were also practical. It was not. The signing lessons began on the fourth day. He taught her himself, not through Roderick, sitting across from her at the small table in his study and demonstrating signs with the patient precision of a man who is very good at things and does not feel the need to perform how good he is at them. She was a quick study. She had always known this about herself, had had no real use for it before now. And she watched his hands with an attention that was half study and half something she was trying, carefully, not to examine. His hands were, she noticed this with the slight alarm of someone noticing something they had not intended to notice, extraordinarily expressive. He contained himself in his face and his posture, and his silence, but his hands, when he signed, were precise and fluid, and said things his face did not. She found herself watching them more than was strictly necessary for learning signs. She suspected he noticed. He gave no indication of this, which was, she was beginning to understand, its own kind of indication. Now, I want to pause here and tell you something about the history of sign language in England, because what Piers and Winifred were building between themselves in that study had a context that most people in 1854 did not know, and that I think matters enormously to this story. The British Deaf Association would not be formally established until 1890, but the communities and communication systems that made it possible had been developing across Britain for nearly a century before that. Since the late 18th century, schools and communities for deaf individuals had been forming across the country, centering in Edinburgh, in London, in the larger provincial cities, and in the classrooms and streets and gathering places of those communities. A system of hand signs had been developing, refined, passed between people, shaped by use into something that was not yet standardized but was already rich and functional and entirely capable of carrying complex thought. What Piers had was not a single system, but a composite. Signs he had encountered in the early years after his deafness, signs that Roderick had adapted and extended over 14 years of close work, signs that Piers himself had invented for concepts that existing systems did not cover. It was a private language built on a communal foundation, and it was, by 1854, as nuanced as spoken English in everything that mattered to him. When Winifred learned it, and she learned it with the focused appetite of a mind that had been waiting for something sufficiently complex to occupy it, she was not merely learning to communicate with her husband. She was stepping into a world that society had decided did not exist. She found in that world that she had never felt more fluent in her life. Now, here is where I need to pause, because I have been telling you about conversations and signing lessons and dinner in a beautiful house, and I want you to understand something. While all of this was unfolding quietly inside Waverley House, Desmond Farley was not idle. He had told his joke. He had collected the acknowledgement that his debt was cleared, and he had told himself that the matter was finished, that he had arranged a tidy solution and could move on to his next problem. But there is a particular danger in men who believe themselves untouchable. They become careless. And careless men who have already demonstrated their cruelty to an audience begin to look for new performances. What Farley did next was not calculated. It was the instinct of a man who had enjoyed a joke and wanted to extend it. He wrote to Winifred. The letter arrived on the 9th day of her marriage, delivered through channels that suggested he had taken some care to ensure it bypassed the household's normal correspondence management. Roderick brought it to her with an expression that was entirely neutral and therefore communicative. She opened it. It was charming in the way of things designed to wound through the appearance of warmth. He congratulated her on her elevation. He expressed, with the elaborate irony of a man who believes his wit is appreciated, his hope that she was finding the Duke's company stimulating, such as it was. He noted that he had heard Waverley House was very grand, and that she must be finding it all quite overwhelming, coming as she did from such different circumstances. Then, in the final paragraph, he dropped the pretense entirely. "I trust you understand," he wrote, "the nature of the arrangement that brought you to where you are. It would be a shame for the Duke to learn that his new Duchess was acquired as a settlement of debt rather than through any personal preference. Such knowledge might alter his perception of the value of the transaction. I mention this only as a friend, of course. As someone who wishes you every happiness in your new situation and hopes you will remember in the months to come who it was that thought of you when no one else did." She read this 3 times. Then she set it down on her writing desk, very carefully, and sat for a moment in the particular silence of a woman who has just been threatened by a man who believes her powerless. She took the letter to Piers. She found him in the library, surrounded by open books, and she crossed the room and set the letter on the table beside him. He read it. She watched his face. His expression did not change in any visible way, but she had been studying his face for nearly 2 weeks, and she was fluent enough now to see what was not there, the winter expression settling over what had been, a moment ago, the particular openness he wore only when reading, like watching a window close. His hands. "He told you nothing you did not already know." "I know," she said. "I'm not frightened of him." His eyes came up to her face. The winter expression stayed, but something moved behind it. "You should not have to manage this." "I'm not asking you to manage it," she said clearly. "I'm asking you to know about it. There is a difference." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he folded the letter and placed it inside his coat, and his hands said, with a brevity that conveyed something far larger, "Noted." That evening Roderick told her, without explanation, that Mr. Farley's correspondence would no longer reach her. She did not ask how, but Farley was not finished. He came to Waverley House on a Wednesday afternoon in the 4th week of her marriage, without a calling card, without an appointment, and, when the footman quite correctly informed him that the Duchess was not receiving Calstorop potismo mocassazn soul, he stood on the front step and said, loudly enough to be heard from the street, that he would wait. He waited for 40 minutes on the front step of Waverley House, while 2 footmen stood inside the door, and the neighbours of one of London's most prestigious streets observed a man making a spectacle of himself outside a duke's residence. Winifred learned of this from Mrs. Price, who delivered the information with the expressionless precision of a woman who understands that information is power and should be delivered accurately. "He departed approximately 10 minutes ago, Your Grace. He left a verbal message." Which was? Mrs. Price's expression remained entirely still. He said that the Duchess would do well to remember her friends. She went directly to Piers. She told him. He stood and wrote 4 lines on a fresh sheet of paper, sealed it with the ducal seal, and handed it to Roderick without a word. The note went out within the hour. Farley did not return to the step. But he did not stop. I need to tell you what happened on a Tuesday evening in the 5th week of Winifred's marriage, because this is the part of the story that I find most difficult to write. And I want to tell you why, because I think it matters. When I write women like Winifred, women who have spent years making themselves small, who have learned to absorb cruelty without flinching because flinching costs more than absorbing, I am always aware of a particular danger in the storytelling. The danger of making what happens to them seem manageable, survivable in a way that diminishes it. Because Winifred is composed and clear-eyed and she does not collapse, and it would be easy to let that composure read as proof that it was not so bad. It was bad. What Farley did next was bad. And I want you to feel that, not just understand it. Winifred had been to visit Tabitha. It was a regular arrangement. Tuesdays, late afternoon, returning before dark. The Alcott house was a 20-minute carriage ride from Waverley House, through streets that were busy enough in the afternoon and quieter by dusk when the fashionable traffic had moved indoors. He had, it emerged later, been watching the house on Tuesdays, waiting for exactly this. The one afternoon she travelled without a male escort, on a route he had calculated, at a time he had observed. It was the action not of impulse, but of a man who had decided, with the cold patience of wounded pride, that he would not be ignored. She was in the carriage on the return journey, alone except for the coachman on the box, when it slowed unexpectedly. She heard voices outside, the coachman's, surprised, and then a voice she recognized, smooth and unhurried, saying something she could not make out. A gentleman's voice. The coachman would have had no reason to refuse. Then the door opened. Farley climbed into the carriage. He was not drunk. She registered this immediately, because it would have been easier to understand if he were. He was entirely sober and entirely deliberate, and he sat down across from her in the space of a moving carriage, and looked at her with the expression of a man who has decided that charm has failed and something else is required. "I think," he said, pleasantly, "that you and I need to have a conversation that your husband cannot interrupt." She kept her face still. She kept her hand still in her lap. She was aware, with absolute clarity, of the smallness of the carriage, of the coachman on the box who could not see inside, of the street outside the window that was growing quieter as they moved away from the busier thoroughfares. "I don't believe we do," she said. He leaned forward. His forearms came down on his knees, and he brought his face to within a foot of hers and looked at her with an expression that was not the expression of a man playing a social game. It was the expression of a man who had been refused and had decided, in the particular way of men who have never been refused, that the word did not apply to him. "You were nothing," he said softly. "Before I arranged this, you were a joke in your own right. The Alcott girl, still unmarried at 23, too proud and too plain and too—" "Mr. Farley," she said it very quietly, "take your hand off my arm." She had not looked down when he grabbed her. She looked at him directly. At his face, at the ugly thing she could see there now that the charm had entirely fallen away. And she said it again, more quietly. "Remove your hand." He did not remove his hand. His grip tightened on her forearm until she could feel the pressure of each individual finger through her sleeve, and he leaned closer and said, You will tell your husband to call off whatever he has set in motion. You will tell him you asked him to, or I will make very certain that every person in London understands exactly how this marriage was arranged and exactly what kind of woman was desperate enough to accept it." She looked at him for one long, completely still moment. Then she turned her head toward the carriage window and said, at full volume, "Stop the carriage." The coachman, who had been, she learned later, listening with furious attention since the moment the door had opened, pulled the horses up immediately. Farley released her arm. She opened the carriage door herself. She stepped down onto the street. A street that was not entirely empty, that had a gentleman on the opposite pavement who had already turned at the sound of a carriage stopping abruptly, who was already looking. And she stood on the pavement and looked back up at Farley in the carriage with the expression she had been perfecting since she was 16 years old. "Good evening, Mr. Farley," she said clearly, in a voice that carried exactly as far as the gentleman across the street. "I suggest you find another conveyance home." She walked the remaining distance to Waverley House. It took 11 minutes. Her arm, where his hand had been, ached with a dull persistence she was not going to think about until she was inside. Roderick was at the door before she reached it. He took one look at her face and turned without a word and went, she assumed, directly to Piers. She was still in her outer things, unwinding her bonnet ribbons with fingers that were not quite steady, when Piers appeared in the entrance hall. He looked at her. His eyes went to her arm, to the sleeve, where nothing was visible but something in her posture had communicated itself. His face went through several things in rapid succession that were not the winter expression and were not controlled at all. She held up her hand, palm out. "I am all right." He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. His jaw was set in a way she had not seen before, not cold, not composed, but the particular stillness of something held back by main force. She crossed the hall and stood before him and said, quietly and clearly, "I am all right. He frightened me. He did not hurt me. The coachman witnessed everything. The gentleman across the street witnessed everything." She paused. "I believe you will find the account useful." His hands moved. "His name will not appear in polite society again. I promise you this." She looked at him for a moment. Then, because she was tired and her arm ached, and she had walked 11 minutes in the dusk on a London street and arrived at a house that was hers, with a man in it who looked at her like that, she stepped forward and put her forehead against his shoulder. He went very still. Then his arms came around her, carefully, with the deliberateness he brought to everything, and he held her with a gentleness that did not match any of the other things she knew about him and matched, somehow, all of them. They stood like that in the entrance hall for a long moment. His hand moved slowly against her back, and she could feel the steadiness of him, the particular quality of someone who will not be moved. And she breathed it in and let herself, for the first time, be held. "I have you," his hand said against her back, not signed, just pressed, flat-palmed, unmistakable. "I have you." "I know," she said into his shoulder. "I know." She did not know yet what was coming next. The card-room, the execution, the gold gown in a ballroom full of people who had once looked straight through her. She did not know that the man whose hands were pressed flat against her back had been building toward that evening for months, that every piece was already in place, that Farley's destruction had been designed before she had even signed the contract. All she knew, standing in the entrance hall of Waverley House with her arm still aching and her face pressed into her husband's shoulder, was that she had arrived, that the door had been there, that someone had been waiting on the other side of it. Whatever came next, she would not face it alone. The coachman's testimony, combined with the account of the gentleman on the pavement, who turned out to be an acquaintance of Piers's solicitor, which Winifred did not find surprising in the least, went into the file that Roderick had been building for weeks. It was the piece that transformed Piers's planned financial ruin of Farley into something considerably more permanent. Because a man who grabs a duchess in a carriage and threatens her on a public street has not merely made a social error, he has made a legal one. Now I want to pause here, because I need to say something directly to you. I have written a lot of scenes like the carriage scene. Women alone in small spaces with men who have decided that no is a suggestion. And every time I write one, I am aware of something that I think storytelling sometimes gets wrong. The composure. The way these women hold themselves together in the moment. The way they find the precise words, the way they walk. 11 minutes in the dark and arrive at the door and give the information efficiently before they allow themselves to be held. I want to name that composure for what it is. It is not strength in the way we usually mean strength. It is the specific capability of a woman who has had to practice for years at managing things alone that she should never have had to manage alone. It is skill born of necessity, and it is, in its own way, one of the saddest things I know how to write. What moves me about Winifred, what made me want to tell this story in the first place, is that she arrives at a house where someone is already at the door, where the holding is waiting for her, where she does not have to manage this one alone. That is what I want for all of us, someone already at the door. If that landed for you tonight, tell me in the comments. The jealousy arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in the form of a calling card on a silver tray. Lord Terence Breckenridge, a young lord of 25, handsome in the conventional way, who had danced with Winifred twice at a ball 2 years prior and subsequently failed to call. He had recently been observed at his club expressing regret about this oversight in terms that his friends found entertaining. She received him in the front drawing room with the composure of a woman who has been managing unwanted attention her entire adult life. He was charming and slightly nervous and operating under the impression that a duchess who had married under peculiar circumstances might be sympathetic to expressions of belated interest. She disabused him of this impression in approximately 9 minutes, with such thorough courtesy that he thanked her on his way out without quite understanding that he had been refused. Piers appeared in the doorway as Breckenridge's retreating footsteps sounded in the corridor. He looked at her, then at the doorway, then back at her. His expression was controlled in the particular way that meant it, was effortfully controlled. "He came to pay his respects," she said, his hands, and I thanked him for his visit. He will not be back." He looked at her for a moment, then he crossed the room unhurriedly in the way he moved through spaces as though they belonged to him, and stopped closer than he usually stood. His hand came to her wrist, not gripping, simply resting there, his thumb finding the inside of her wrist, where her pulse was doing something she hoped was not legible. His other hand signed, slowly and clearly, "You, mine." "Yes?" "Yes," she said, steadily. His grip tightened for just a moment. Then he released her and turned and went back toward the corridor, and stopped, because Breckenridge had not yet reached the front door. He was still in the entrance hall, collecting his hat and gloves from the footman, and Piers walked to the top of the stairs and looked down at him with the winter expression fully deployed, in complete silence for a period of approximately 5 seconds. Breckenridge looked up. He saw the Duke of Waverley looking at him from the top of the stairs with an expression that communicated, without a single word, the precise and absolute nature of the situation. He left very quickly. The footman who witnessed this described it below stairs as the most efficient departure he had ever seen. Roderick, appearing from somewhere, spoke in a voice that was entirely conversational. His Grace suggests that Lord Breckenridge might find the afternoon air more agreeable elsewhere. This sentence was not directed at Breckenridge, who had already gone. It was directed at the two footmen who were present, who would repeat it. By evening it had reached 3 other households. By morning it was understood throughout the relevant social circles that the Duke of Waverley regarded his Duchess as his in a manner that left no room for alternative interpretation. Piers returned to the drawing-room. He stood before Winifred for a moment. His expression was controlled again, the effort showing, but the control holding. She looked at him with all the steadiness she possessed and said, "That was rather more than was strictly necessary." His hands, without a flicker. "Yes." She pressed her lips together very hard to keep from smiling. Now, Blanche Edgeworth. Because Blanche was not simply a woman who had been unkind at card parties. She was a woman whose entire social identity depended on being the arbiter of who mattered and who did not. And Winifred's elevation to Duchess had not merely complicated that identity. It had exposed a specific and personal failure at its centre. Blanche had looked at Winifred Alcott for 2 years and seen nothing worth looking at. She had told people this. She had staked her social credibility on this assessment, had built it into the foundation of how she understood her own discernment. And Piers Hawthorne, Duke of Waverley, had looked at the same woman and seen something worth 3 years of watching, worth a marriage, worth the full deployment of a power that dwarfed anything Blanche Edgeworth had ever commanded. That was not merely a social reversal. It was a verdict on Blanche's judgment. And a woman whose identity depends on being right about people cannot survive being this wrong about one. She began a campaign, not loudly, not with anything that could be identified as slander, but through suggestion and implication and the careful placement of doubts. A raised eyebrow here, a certain hesitation there. A comment about the suddenness of the match offered in the tone of a woman who is simply concerned. She communicated through every available channel that the Duke of Waverley had been deceived, that the woman installed as his Duchess was not what she appeared. By the 6th week of her marriage, Winifred felt this directly. On the occasion she attended a morning visit at which Blanche happened to be present. Blanche did not speak to her unkindly. Blanche was too skilled for that. She simply spoke around her. She directed every question to the women on either side of Winifred. She laughed at every remark except Winifred's, and when Winifred spoke, she listened with the particular quality of not quite listening that communicates to everyone in the room that the speaker is not worth attending to. Winifred sat through 45 minutes of this. She contributed to the conversation with the steady composure of a woman who has been practicing this exact form of endurance since she was 16. She drank her tea. She smiled pleasantly. She gave Blanche Edgeworth nothing to grip, but she felt every minute of it, in the particular place where 23 years of being overlooked had already worn her thin. She went home and went directly to the library and sat in the chair nearest the fire and breathed, very deliberately, for several minutes. Piers found her there. He came in without ceremony and he sat in the chair across from hers and looked at her face and said nothing, because he had learned with the precision he applied to everything, exactly when she needed silence and exactly when she needed words. After a moment she told him what had happened, not dramatically, simply as information. His hands, when she finished. It will not be the last time she does this, but it will become harder for her to sustain. "I know," she said. "I am not asking you to stop it." "I know you're not." A pause. Then, "I am asking myself to. There is a difference." She looked at him. She felt something move in her chest that was warm and specific and entirely his fault. "You are not allowed to be that precisely right about things," she said. "It is very inconvenient." The ghost of amusement. His hands. Noted. The rupture came from the direction she had not been watching. Tabitha's friend, Miss Hensley, well-meaning and entirely unable to keep a confidence, had heard at a morning visit she should not have attended a version of the Farley story as told by Blanche Edgeworth. The version Blanche had constructed was elegant in its cruelty. It said not that Winifred was unworthy, but that Winifred had known about the arrangement, had sought it out, had used Farley as an intermediary deliberately. That the whole thing had been her manoeuvre, not Farley's, and that the Duke of Waverley was the one who had been managed. That his deafness had made him vulnerable, and she had exploited it. Miss Hensley, in the manner of young women who mistake the sharing of information for friendship, repeated this to Tabitha. Tabitha came to Winifred with it immediately, in a state of distress she was trying and failing to conceal. Winifred listened to all of it. Then she went to find Piers. He was in the East Wing, reviewing estate accounts with his steward, and would be occupied for the better part of the afternoon. She went back to her room. She sat at her dressing table. She looked at her own face in the glass. Blanche's version was entirely false. She knew this. Piers knew this. But the story was spreading. She could feel it, the way one feels weather changing, a shift in the air before the rain arrives. And the particular cruelty of Blanche's construction was that it could not be disproved by protest. Protest would look like guilt. Silence would look like admission. And there was something else. Something she had not said to anyone. She had signed the contract. She had chosen this marriage with clear eyes and clear information. She had not sought it. That much was true. But had she used it? Had she looked at what was being offered and seen opportunity where she should have seen warning? Had she stepped into this house and these rooms and this life and not deceived him? No, she had never deceived him, but taken something she had not quite been offered. She looked at her face in the glass for a long time. Then she did something she had not done since she was a girl. She cried, quietly, briefly, with the contained efficiency of a woman who has long practice at emotions she cannot afford to sustain. She cried for 23 years of it, the £400, Blanche Edgeworth's precision, her own uncertainty about whether she had been wise or simply desperate. Then she stopped, washed her face, and went down to dinner. Piers was already at the table. He looked at her immediately. He always looked at her immediately when she entered a room, and she watched him read her face the way he read text, carefully, gathering information from what was present and what was not. She sat down. She kept her expression pleasant. She was extremely good at pleasant. He watched her through the first course. Then he set down his fork, and his hands moved. "What happened?" "Nothing," she said, pleasantly. He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze with the smile she had been perfecting since she was 16. She saw the moment he decided not to accept it. Something quiet and specific changed behind his eyes. He signed, "That is the face you showed Blanche Edgeworth at the card party." She went absolutely still. "I have been watching you for some time." His hands were steady. "I know every face you have. That one is for people who are hurting you." She looked at his hands. She looked at his face. "You are not hurting me," she said. "I know. But something is." The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the silence of a woman who has been seen through a mask she had been wearing so long she had forgotten it was a mask. She set down her fork. "Blanche Edgeworth is saying that I arranged this," she said. Flat and clear, because she was past pretending. "That I used Farley deliberately, that the deception was mine, not his, that you were the one managed." She watched him read her lips. She watched him absorb it. Then, "I know." She stared. "You know. I know what she is saying. I have known for 4 days." A pause. I was deciding how to answer it. "4 days," she said. Something moved through her that was not quite anger and not quite relief, and was partly the exhaustion of having carried something alone that he had apparently been carrying alongside her. "You knew for 4 days, and you—" "I did not want you to feel it required managing." His hands were very clear. "It is my name. It is my position. I am the one who can answer this. You should not have to answer for a slander about yourself." She looked at him. "I have been answering for things about myself," she said slowly, "since I was 16 years old." "I know." He held her gaze. "I am asking you to let me do it this time." She pressed her lips together. She looked at the table. She looked back at him. "That is very difficult for me," she said finally. "Honestly, his hands. I know that too." She sat with it for a moment, the firelight moving on the walls, the candlesticks reflecting their own small flames, the rain, which had started again, tapping steadily at the windows. "Piers," she said. He went very still. She had not used his name before, not like this, not across a dinner table, not with this particular directness. She watched what it did to his face. "I would like," she said carefully, "to not do this alone, if the offer still stands." His hands moved without pause. It was never a temporary offer. It was the almost that undid her. 3 weeks into their marriage, on a night when the rain had been coming down in sheets since late afternoon, she came to the library because she could not sleep, and the library was the room in the house that felt most like refuge. He was already there. She stopped in the doorway. He was in the chair nearest the fire, one ankle crossed over the opposite knee, a book open in his lap, the firelight catching the angles of his face and turning his grey eyes amber. He had taken off his coat. He was in shirt sleeves, which she had not seen before, and she was aware, with a sudden sharpness, of the architecture of his shoulders and the line of his jaw in the firelight, and of the fact that she was standing in the doorway of a dark library in her nightgown and wrapper, looking at her husband with an expression she was not controlling. He looked up. He saw her. He did not look away. She crossed the room and sat in the chair across from his, because it was closer to the fire and because she needed somewhere to put herself that was not the doorway. They sat in silence for a moment, the rain against the windows, the fire settling in the grate, the darkness pressing in from the edges of the room. She was cold. She had come down without thinking, and it must have been apparent in the way she pulled her wrapper closer, because he set his book aside and rose from his chair and disappeared briefly into the shadows at the edge of the room. He returned with a blanket, heavy wool from the chest against the wall, and he came and stood before her and held it out. She reached for it. Their hands touched, not the glancing through-silk contact of the wrist in the drawing room. Her hand and his hand, both bare, in the warm half-dark of the library, with the fire between them and the rain outside and nobody else in the world. Neither of them moved. She looked down at their hands. She looked up at his face. He was very close. Closer than he had been in the drawing room, close enough that she could see the firelight move in his eyes and the careful, deliberate way he was breathing. His thumb moved across the back of her hand, slowly, barely, the suggestion of pressure. And she felt it in her chest, in her throat, in every part of her that had been pretending for weeks that she was approaching this marriage with perfectly managed composure. She was not managing anything. She had not been managing anything for some time. He leaned toward her. She leaned toward him. The firelight shifted. His free hand came up toward her face. The door opened. A footman, young, conscientious, entirely unaware, carrying a coal scuttle for the morning, his usual round. The same route he walked every night at this hour, the same door he opened without thinking, because the library was always empty at this time. It was not empty. He stopped in the doorway. He took in the scene, the two of them, close, hands together, the charged quality of the air between them. And his face went through approximately 4 distinct expressions in the space of 2 seconds before settling on a blankness so absolute it was itself a kind of performance. "Your Grace," he said, to no one in particular. "I beg your pardon." He withdrew. The door closed behind him with a quiet precision that suggested a man exercising every ounce of discretion he possessed. Winifred and Piers did not move for a moment. Then she became aware, slowly, of the distance that had opened between them. Not large, not dramatic, just the automatic retreat of two people who have been interrupted by the specific, suffocating machinery of a house full of eyes. A house where nothing was private because everything required management. A house where even the library at midnight had a footman's round. She looked at her hands, alone now in her lap. He handed her the blanket. His face was entirely controlled. She now knew with fluency how much work that control was doing. He signed, with hands that were not quite steady. "Good night." "Good night," she said. She took the blanket. She went back to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time in the dark, with the blanket around her shoulders, not sleeping, not trying to, listening to the rain and thinking about a footman's round and the specific, maddening, inescapable tyranny of a house that was never empty. She understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that she was running out of time to pretend she did not love him. Below stairs, the footman in question said nothing to anyone about what he had seen. He was, by all accounts, an exceptionally discreet young man. He did, however, request a different route for his nightly rounds the following week. She left that night, not because she wanted to, but because the thing she had been carrying for 23 years, the muscle memory of managing alone, the deep-seated certainty that depending on anyone was the first step toward being failed by them, rose up in her in the small hours of the morning and would not let her stay still. She wrote him a note at 3 in the morning by candlelight, sitting at her desk in her wrapper, with her hair undone, and she told him the truth, that she did not know how to accept help, that she had built her survival on requiring nothing from anyone, that she was frightened, not of Blanche, not of Farley, but of herself, of the wanting she could feel growing in her chest every time he looked at her, of what it would mean to give someone that kind of purchase on her and then lose it. She wrote, "I need a day. Only a day. I am not leaving. I am only stepping back where I can breathe." She went to Tabitha's house before dawn. He did not come after her. She had half expected him to, had half braced herself for the arrival of Roderick at the door with a formal request or a note. But the morning passed quietly, and the afternoon, and no one came. Tabitha sat with her through most of the morning and said very little. She made tea. She kept the fire. She occasionally looked at Winifred with the expression of someone who has a great deal to say, and is deciding, with unusual wisdom, not to say it. At 3:30 in the afternoon, she said, "Is he terrible to you?" "No," Winifred said immediately. He is the opposite of terrible to me." Tabitha considered this. "Is it that you are frightened of being happy?" Winifred looked at her sister. "Because," Tabitha said carefully, "I have noticed that you are very good at managing unhappiness, and I have sometimes wondered whether you have practiced it so long that happiness feels like a thing that happens to other people." Winifred sat with this for a long time. At 4:30 she went back. Roderick met her in the entrance hall, not formally, simply standing there as though he had happened to be nearby, which she understood meant he had been waiting. "Where is he?" she said. "The library, Your Grace." She went to the library. He was where she had found him the night of the rain, in the chair nearest the fire, a book open in his lap. He looked up when she entered. He set the book down. She crossed the room and stood before him and said, "I am sorry. The note was cowardly. I should have said it to your face." He looked at her steadily. "I am frightened," she said, "not of you, of wanting something from you that I cannot take back if it goes wrong. I have careful for a very long time, careful not to want things that could be taken away." His hands, "I know." And then, "I have been careful for 15 years. I understand careful." "I came back," she said. "I know." A pause. "I did not follow you because I thought you might need to know I would not." She understood this completely. He had let her go because he knew she needed to know she could. "That was very precisely right," she said, her voice not entirely steady. He stood. He was close, the library close, the firelight close, and he looked at her with the winter expression entirely gone and something in its place that was entirely unguarded. His hands. "I have been watching you since December of 51, in a green gown, at the back row of a musicale, reading the program with an attention that suggested you would rather have been reading something else. I thought then that I had never seen anyone more carefully hidden." She could not speak for a moment. "I am not going to let you hide in this house." His hands continued with absolute steadiness. "I am also not going to take anything from you that you do not give me freely. Both of those things are true at the same time." "December of 51, she said. 3 years. "Yes." "Why didn't you?" "I was afraid." The sign he used was something closer to not ready to be refused. "That you would refuse me, and I would have to find a way to stop watching." She pressed her lips together for a moment, very hard. "I would not have refused you," she said. His hands, quietly. "I know that now." She stepped forward, a small, deliberate step, closing the last of the space between them, and she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, her palm against the warmth of his face, and she felt him go completely still beneath her hand, the way something goes still when it finally stops moving. "Piers," she said. He kissed her, not the slow approach of something contained. This was the kiss of a man who has been waiting 3 years and has finally, completely, stopped waiting. It held everything he did not say in the ordinary course of things: the watching, the planning, the 3 years of standing at the back of rooms to be near someone who didn't know he was there. And she received it with everything she had been folding carefully away for 23 years, and felt for the first time in her memory the absolute relief of being found. When he lifted his head, she was holding the lapel of his coat in both hands, which she had not noticed herself doing. He looked at her face with an expression she had read in his journal without knowing it, the expression of a man who has been given something he had not been sure he was allowed to want. "I did not know," she said, "that it was possible to feel like this." His hands against her back. "Neither did I. I want to stop here for just a moment because I think this is the scene in this story that has stayed with me the longest since I wrote it. I think it is because both of them arrived at that library having spent years believing, on some quiet level, that this kind of thing was for other people. The being found, the being chosen, the someone who looks for you specifically, in the back rows of rooms you have stopped expecting to matter in. I started this channel because I believed in that, in the particular power of stories about people who were written off finding each other. And every time I think I have told that story as well as I can, I find a new version of it that breaks me open all over again. If that resonated with you tonight, leave me a comment and tell me. I want to know. Now. I promised you Farley's lesson. Let me tell you how it was delivered. It began with a letter, not to Farley directly, but to every significant creditor he possessed. Each letter contained documentation of debts owed, terms violated, legal obligations outstanding. Each bore the ducal seal of Waverley. These letters did not demand payment. They simply existed. In the offices of lawyers and the hands of moneylenders and the ledgers of establishments that Farley had been charming his way through for years. And because they bore the name Hawthorne, Duke of Waverley, they were received with a seriousness that Farley's own creditors had never previously applied. The calls began arriving at Farley's townhouse within a week, but the mechanism was only preparation. The real lesson, the one that would be told about in drawing rooms for the remainder of the season and well into the next, was the execution at Blanche Edgeworth's spring ball. Piers had timed it with the precision of a man who understood crowds. Roderick, moving quietly through the room for the preceding 30 minutes, had ensured that the people who needed to be in the right place were there. The solicitor, with Farley's debt documentation, was near the card-room doorway. 2 witnesses, both men of standing, both with their own settled grievances against Farley, were nearby. The society columnist who wrote the morning gossip column that half of London read over their breakfast was near enough to the centre of the room to hear everything clearly. And the gentleman who had been on the pavement the evening Farley boarded Winifred's carriage was positioned where he could be called upon if required. Winifred arrived at the Edgeworth townhouse in a gown of deep gold silk, with her hair dressed and her posture straight, and Piers Hawthorne, Duke of Waverley, at her side. The effect of their entrance was immediate. Not dramatic, not a hush at the door, but a ripple of attention that moved through the ballroom like wind through tall grass as eyes moved toward them and whispers moved behind fans. Farley was there. She had expected him. He sat near the champagne table holding court with 2 young men who were laughing at something he had said. He saw her. His expression cycled through surprise, calculation, and settled on the smirk of a man who has told himself that whatever happens, he holds the advantage. He had not held the advantage for approximately 8 weeks, but he did not know this yet. Piers guided her toward the card room with a slight pressure of his hand on hers. Farley followed. He could not help himself. In the card room, with perhaps 20 people present in various stages of play, Farley approached with the confidence of a man who believes himself untouchable. "Your Grace," to Piers, with the bonhomie of assumed safety. "And Your Grace," to Winifred, with the smile that said, "Look what I made." Piers did not look at him. He reached into his coat and removed a document, folded, sealed, bearing the solicitor's signature, and held it out in Farley's direction without looking at him. Farley took it. He looked at it. His face changed. The document was a comprehensive accounting of every debt Farley held, every creditor called in, every legal obligation now pending, with a total that was alarming. At the bottom, in Piers's handwriting, "The proposal you made regarding Miss Alcott was not, as you represented it to your associates, a joke at my expense. I was aware of your proposition, your commentary, and your motives from the outset. I accepted the arrangement because it suited my purposes, as it has proved to do." A second sheet, beneath the first, contained the coachman's sworn testimony and the account of the gentleman on the pavement. Farley looked up. His face was the colour of old ash. The room, which had gone quiet by degrees, was watching. Piers finally looked at Farley. His expression was the winter expression, perfectly still, perfectly cold, with the quality of something that has been waiting a very long time to arrive. Roderick spoke, in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the room. "His Grace advises you that your debts have been called in. His Grace also advises you that the two gentlemen to your left witnessed your remarks at your club on the 14th of March and have provided sworn statements regarding their content. His Grace further advises you that the matter of the carriage on the 17th of April has been documented and witnessed and will be presented to the relevant authorities should any further approach be made to his household or his Duchess. His Grace wishes me to convey, and I quote directly, that you may consider the joke delivered. Roderick's voice, when he delivered it, was the same voice he used for everything. Appointments, correspondence, the morning schedule, the names of callers at the door. Winifred had heard it across 14 years of the Duke's life compressed into 7 weeks of her own, and she knew its precise quality the way she knew the weight of the house around her. She had never heard it carry quite that particular note before. Not satisfaction exactly, something older than satisfaction, something that had been waiting considerably longer than she had. The room was absolutely silent. Farley stood with the documents in his shaking hands, in the stillness of a man who has understood that the flaw beneath him is not flaw at all. Not social flaw, not financial flaw, not any flaw. Just the long drop of consequences he had spent his entire life outrunning, arriving at last. He looked at Winifred. She met his gaze with the expression she had been perfecting since she was 16 years old. Not warm, not cold, entirely unreadable, offering nothing for cruelty to grip. The same expression he had watched her deploy at Blanche Edgeworth's card table, on the night he had decided she was manageable. She had been perfecting it, as it turned out, specifically for this moment. "Good evening, Mr. Farley," she said pleasantly. In the morning column, 3 days later, the society columnist noted that Desmond Farley had left Blanche Edgeworth's ball, looking considerably shaken, and had subsequently been seen at neither his club nor any significant social engagement. His townhouse was for let. The columnist noted with the particular satisfaction of the socially observant that the Duchess of Waverley had worn gold to the Edgeworth ball and had looked, in the words of multiple witnesses, as though she had been born to it. Farley left for the continent. He did not return for 11 years. Blanche Edgeworth's lesson was quieter and took longer and was, in certain respects, more complete. Winifred simply became the Duchess of Waverley in the eyes of every person whose opinion Blanche had spent years cultivating. Not aggressively, not in any way that could be identified and opposed, but in the slow, inexorable way of water finding its level. She accepted invitations and returned them. She spoke to people warmly and remembered details about their lives and asked intelligent questions about things they cared about, with the patience of a woman who had spent 23 years being overlooked and had discovered that the same skills worked equally well in reverse. She invited Blanche to a dinner. Formally, properly, with precedence observed, Blanche could not decline without refusing a duchess. She sat Blanche near the end of the table, below 3 women who had previously been within Blanche's orbit, and was entirely, graciously, unbearably kind to her for the entire evening. Blanche left early. She did not look, as she left, like a woman who had won anything at all. Winifred watched her go from the doorway of her own dining room, in her own gold silk, in her own house, and felt the satisfaction settle into her chest like something that had been waiting a very long time to land. Across the room, Piers was watching her. She met his gaze. His hands moved, just barely, just far enough for her to read. Perfect. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to her guests and smiled and went on. The July morning. There is a small scene I want to tell you about, because it is not dramatic and it is not a revelation. And it is the scene I have thought about most since this story took shape. It happened on a Tuesday morning in July, 3 months into the marriage, when London was doing its brief summer impression of warmth, and the light through the library windows was actual gold rather than its usual grey suggestion. Winifred was at the table with the estate correspondence. She had been managing more and more of the household's administrative weight, which Mrs. Price had handed over with the transparent relief of a woman who had been waiting years for someone with both the intelligence and the willingness. Piers was at his desk. Roderick was not in the room. An increasing frequency as their communication had developed to the point where they needed him less for ordinary conversation. 3 months of lessons that had accelerated beyond anything she had expected, because she was a quick study and he was a precise teacher, and they had, it emerged, been speaking the same language for considerably longer than either of them had been willing to admit. Tabitha arrived at 11 with Miss Hensley, who had been spending the month since the Blanche incident in the quietly earnest project of demonstrating her better nature. She was brought to the library by a footman who had learned that the Duchess was usually to be found there in the mornings. Tabitha stopped in the doorway. Both of them, Winifred at the correspondence table, Piers at his desk, working in the same room in the easy silence that is not the absence of communication, but its fullest expression. Their hands occasionally moving. An exchange of something, a note, a query, a dry observation that made Winifred's mouth curve, conducted in the private language they had built between themselves from his signing and her attention and 3 months of shared mornings. Tabitha looked at this for a long moment. Then she looked at Miss Hensley. Then she looked back at her sister. Her careful sister who had spent 23 years folding herself small enough to fit in rooms where she had not been wanted, who had been traded for a debt of £400, who had walked into this marriage with her eyes open and her spine straight and had arrived somehow here. And her expression said without words everything she had been carrying since the card party and through every morning since. Winifred caught her eye. She raised her eyebrow. A question. Tabitha smiled. The full, unguarded smile of a girl who has been worrying about her sister for years and has just conclusively stopped. Winifred turned back to the correspondence. Piers, who had noted the arrival without looking up, signed in her direction. "Your sister." "I know," she signed back. A pause. Then his hands. "She looks relieved." Winifred looked at her correspondence. She felt in her chest the particular warmth of something that has been true for a while and has just been acknowledged. "Yes." She signed. "So am I." She set down her pen for a moment. Outside the library windows, London carried on. The sounds of horses on the cobbles, a vendor's call somewhere below, the ordinary texture of a summer morning in a city that did not know and did not particularly care. That somewhere inside this house, a woman who had spent 23 years folding herself invisible was sitting in a pool of actual gold light, doing work that mattered, in a language she had built herself next to a man who had been looking for her specifically since December of '51. She picked up her pen again. She went on. "Now, I must take you back to where we began, to the wedding night, to the bedchamber with its candles and its high ceiling and the 2 maids who would tell the story for the rest of their lives. She was sitting at the dressing table in her wedding gown, her hands folded in her lap. The candles had burned lower by then, their light warmer and more amber, softening the edges of the room. The house was enormous and silent around her, and she was alone with the fact of what she had done. Signed her name to a marriage, stepped into a life she had not chosen, and had then, with clear eyes, chosen. And she was waiting, though she could not have said for what. The door opened. He crossed the room with the unhurried certainty of a man who has decided. He stopped 3 feet from her. She saw him in the mirror first, saw his face in the candlelight, the grey eyes, the jaw, the controlled expression that she did not yet know how to read but would spend the next months learning. She turned on the stool to face him. He was looking at her with an expression she had not yet seen. Not the winter expression, not the ghost of amusement. Something entirely open, entirely still, in the manner of a man who has arrived somewhere he has been moving toward for a very long time. He said her name. Winifred. Precise. Clear. Deliberate. The maids went still. The footman in the corridor went still. And she, Winifred, who had been traded for a debt and handed over as a joke, and who had walked in anyway with her spine straight and her eyes open and her capacity for wanting carefully managed, felt something in her chest crack open like ice at the end of a long winter and did not try to close it, because no one had told him her name. She turned to face him properly. She looked at him in the candlelight. This man, this extraordinary, watchful, patient man, and she understood, in that moment, what she was looking at. Not a joke, not a punchline, not a deaf duke who would never know the difference. She was looking at a man who had been watching for her, specifically in the back rows of rooms she had stopped expecting to matter in, who had spent 3 years and then 3 weeks learning exactly who she was before he said a word to her face, who had practiced her name on his lips until he could produce it clearly, as a gift for this exact moment, because he understood, in the way that people understand things when they have spent a long time being silent and watching, that a woman who had spent her entire life being overlooked deserved, at the very least, to be called by her name. "You practiced," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. He nodded once. "How long?" He held up 2 fingers. 2 weeks, from the moment the wedding date was set. She looked at him for a long, long moment. The candles moved. The house settled around them, enormous and quiet, and hers. "Winifred," he said again, testing it, deliberate, precise. "Yes," she said. "That's right." His hands moved slowly. "Your turn." She held his gaze. Then, "Piers," clearly, directly. His name in her voice, in that room, on that night. She watched what it did to his face. She watched the thing that happened behind his eyes when she said it. The thing that looked like a man receiving something he had not known he was allowed to want. The thing she had no word for in any language she had been taught, but understood, completely, in the language they were already building between themselves. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, her palm against the warmth of his face, and she felt him go completely still beneath her hand, the way something goes still when it finally stops moving. "Piers," she said again, just to say it, just because she could, just because she was 23 years old and had spent 23 years being invisible, and here, in this candle-lit room, in this house that was hers, with this man who had practiced her name for 2 weeks so he could say it precisely on this exact night, here she did not have to be invisible anymore, and he kissed her for the first time, with 2 maids and a footman as witnesses who would all independently describe it later as the least like a transaction and the most like a beginning of anything they had ever seen. I want to close tonight by asking you something real. I have been telling you this story for over an hour, and I need you to know something. I think about these characters after I finish writing them. I think about what it costs to be careful for so long, what it costs to fold yourself small enough that contempt passes over you like weather. And I think about what it means, what it really means, when someone decides to look for you anyway. Not the version of you that society has described, not the version that has learned to take up less space. The actual you, in the back row in a green gown, reading the program with an attention that suggests you would rather be somewhere else. I started telling these stories because I believed in that, in the specific, stubborn power of being found by the right person at the wrong time, in the wrong circumstances, and having it be somehow exactly right. So tell me in the comments. What moment hit you the hardest tonight? The carriage, The journal. The name on the wedding night, the footman's round, his hand saying you don't have to manage everything alone. I want to know. I read every single comment, and your responses are the reason I keep coming back. If you are not yet subscribed, please join us. I am already turning the next story over in my mind, and I genuinely think, it might be the one that breaks you open completely. Subscribe so you are here when it arrives. Until then, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.